Our first presenter is Justin McNeill, and whose project looked into how one particular film was viewed by some young adults. You know, increasingly there's an interest in pop culture for theological insights, and film is a huge contributor to culture with its visual narrative. It speaks to many people, creating its own religion or religions, actually, and speaking positively or negatively about Christianity. What do they tell us about ourselves, about our world, and about our faith? And saga films or trilogy films with futuristic and apocalyptic and dystopic themes are quite the rage now, particularly among young people. And so Justin is going to share his findings this evening with particular focus groups of young people and how they receive theology from a particular movie that saw. So Justin is presenting on faith in the not-so-promised land. So let's welcome Justin.
Well, thank you very much for coming out this evening. I hope I have something interesting to say. For many people, films and movies have become a welcome escape from the mundane reality of life. We escape for a short time into a different and often unbelievable narrative that stimulates our imagination without the need to question the impact that these narratives might have on our own sense of reality. Surely this is the case for many of the films we watch, when we intentionally suspend the rules of nature, of physics, or of just common sense in order to satiate a longing to become a part of something entirely more exciting, more humorous, or more dramatic than our own lives. But what happens when we return to the life that existed before our escape into the silver screen, having experienced something profoundly different than the form and function of our own existence? Are these narratives purely escapism? Or is there the potential within these moments of escape to also encounter something deeply meaningful within ourselves? It is my position that meaningful narrative, regardless of its form, has the capacity to evoke the hearer or viewer with an invitation to encounter something deep within ourselves and something even divine. My name is Justin McNeill, and I love to watch movies. I love to hear and see stories come to life. I enjoy talking through the plot, the themes, the characters of the movies that I watch, and I love to talk with other people about what they see and what they hear coming out of the movies that they watch. Growing up, my family would watch movies together, and quoting movie lines became an inside form of narrative retelling. We could conjure up humor or convey heartfelt emotion simply by quoting a few lines that would form and often reform our shared experiences. This is one of the reasons that I wanted to focus on the role of movies in the lives of other Christians for my graduate research topic. Another reason I chose to focus on film is because as Christians, we are a storytelling people. From our shared Abrahamic history to the parables of Jesus, we seek meaning in the stories we tell and retell as a people of faith. We are called to witness to the power of these narratives and share these narratives the world over. These stories bind us to who we have been and who we are called to be in the future. Paul reminds us that we are called to live in the world, but not to be transformed by the world. But does this mean that everything that is not explicitly Christian should be separated from our own experience? Are our scriptural or canon narratives our only source of wisdom or even critique? Alex Wright states that cinema emphatically reminds us of the importance of a public dimension to any credible Christian theology. Wright goes on to say that the utopian aspirations of modernism have little place here. It is rather dystopian worlds and universes which predominate. Dystopian narratives today function as powerful cultural critiques, subtly or often scathingly condemning the society which they are meant to represent, and often end with the hero standing on the edge of a world that they have helped to change, and yet this world is not yet rebuilt. As one of my participants expressed, dystopian film sort of gives you permission to think about the way that we live and maybe be more critical than we give ourselves permission to be. Parables tend to be much the same. Jesus critiques the value system of his time by telling meaningful stories, many without happy or even satisfying endings. We never find out what happens to the older son after his younger, more prodigal brother returns. Nor do we know if the man beaten and left for dead survives after he is picked up and cared for by the Samaritan. We are also not told if the persistent widow in her victory over the unjust judge is actually restored. We aren't even told what she's actually fighting for. In each of these stories, we are left with more questions than answers, and an expectation that we will continue the work of exegesis for ourselves. With these questions resonating in my mind, I pose the question, how do Christians connect with and relate their faith to popular dystopian films? Often lumped in with post-apocalyptic films, dystopian films are films in which a seemingly utopian society is revealed to be deeply flawed through the actions of a particular protagonist. Dystopian films are normally set in a separated or future societal landscape in which a small set of moral virtues have been elevated to the exclusion of others. Humanity, in trying to create order or perfection, has created a nightmare for itself. Films such as 1927's Metropolis, 1982's Blade Runner, 1997's Gattaca, 2008's Wall-E, or 2012's The Hunger Games, are among a small selection of dystopian films that have remained a popular source of both entertainment and cultural critique. But to examine my question of how do Christians connect with and relate their faith to popular dystopian films, I enlisted the help of two focus groups, one with 6 participants, the other with 7, for a total of 13 participants. Participants were all over the age of 19, and most were considered mid to younger adults. Each focus group gathered to first watch Summit Entertainment's 2014 movie, Divergent, based on a novel of the same name by Veronica Roth. While the plot was not a direct part of my intended study, the film is set in a society in which people are divided into distinct factions based on human virtues. The main character, Beatrice, soon learns that she herself is divergent and won't fit into a single faction. But through the course of the film, it is this divergence which enables her to overcome challenge and eventually save one of the factions from the edge of destruction. Following the film, both groups were asked to discuss a series of questions meant to gather qualitative data that I thought might be helpful in answering my question. After the data was gathered and transcribed, I engaged in a grounded theory process of data analysis. Grounded theory in theological qualitative research does not primarily seek to saturate the data, but is interpretive, seeking information that might be inferred from a smaller sample size. Out of my data, 4 main themes begin to emerge. These themes I have called atheistic tension, 1 Corinthians 13:13, divergent faith, and Christian multiplicity. The first of these themes for both my focus groups was an overwhelming sense of atheistic tension. In each group, there were participants who were uneasy with the absence of God, or really any religious beliefs in the film's narrative. While I should say that this absence of the divine can be a common element in dystopian films or literature, it's not necessarily a defining element of the genre itself. It's interesting that in some dystopian narratives, the expected role of religion is often usurped or taken over by government or some other group bent on maintaining the norms of the societal expectations. But for my participants, the absence of God was concerning. For some, this meant that they themselves found the narrative difficult to enter into. Others felt that they first had to bracket out their beliefs and set them aside just to enjoy the film. It was interesting to note that this was not something that I had really expected to see. But numerous times I heard comments from participants along the lines of, and dystopian films do, they always take God out of the picture as any real living entity. Or with these films where it's like you have to take God out of it. Or finally, one thing I think is fascinating about so many dystopian stuff is the lack of actual religion or faith within the stories. It was interesting to find that there was a distinct sense of tension that had emerged from my participants after being asked to first watch and later reflect on a film with an apparent absence of God or the divine. Participants tended to react to this tension in two interesting ways. Some were actually unwilling to see the film as believable. While dystopian films don't generally try to strive for a particular level of accuracy, generally these films cast a particular style or a particular vision as extrapolated by the author. But for some of my participants, a future without the Christian faith was seen as implausible at best or simply impossible. To be honest, I found this really rather encouraging sentiment. In an age of church decline, especially, according to some reports, in younger demographics. I was intrigued to see such a reaction to what I thought was a common diminishment of the focus of God in popular culture. Other participants in my focus group saw this divine absence as an invitation to see God as a hidden presence within the film, almost reminiscent of the hiddenness of God in some of Bonhoeffer's writings. For these participants, it wasn't so much that God's presence couldn't be present in the film, but rather, in order to fully embrace the film, they felt that they had to first separate or bracket out their faith, and then just enjoy the movie. Which brings me to my second theme that emerged out of my data, 1 Corinthians 13:13, in which Paul writes, "And now faith, hope, and love abide. These three, and the greatest of these is love." It was fascinating for me to see that while there was a strong sense of tension around the film's atheistic narrative, as described by my participants, yet Christian language permeated much of our conversation around the themes that were present in the film. Faith, hope, and love, and particularly love, came up in both focus groups at an astonishing rate. Participants were quick and willing to talk about these three themes in different parts of the film. Even though they felt like they couldn't believe the film's vision of the future or felt that they had to bracket out their own sense of belief structures, faith, hope, and love remained. Now, this could easily and maybe even correctly be explained by the prevalence of Christian language in our Western society, or the makeup of my focus groups, or even Western society's impact on this particular genre. I think if we dismiss this film too quickly, we may risk missing something important. As it turns out, Christians are really not very good at watching movies as anything other than Christians. My participants, as it turned out, weren't actually very good at bracketing out or disregarding the film's narrative based on an absence of God. They said that they were, and maybe they even tried to be, but they couldn't help but see themselves and their faith in the narratives that they were experiencing. Even in talking about other films that they had seen, I heard comments such as, "It's subtle, but it's somewhere in the back of my head, it makes me click and it's another Jesus film." Another participant, after stating that films that take God out of it are almost entirely unbelievable, began talking about another dystopian film that he had seen, saying there was a small glimmer of hope, and it's more believable hope. It's not just mere hope in humanity. There was something more going on in the film. Love was another theme that came up in relation to the film Divergent, as participants related their thoughts, in which there is this theme that if you do that thing out of love, it turns out okay. She also went on to say that it's out of love that another one of the main characters clicks in, and then out of love, kills everybody. But another participant was quick to point out that the love you see through others is the love, like getting pieces of divinity. In these instances, not only were the themes of faith, hope, and love present in the conversation, links were readily being made between these themes and a fully developed theological understanding of these themes and their relation to my participants' own Christian faith. In this way, the language of the Christian experience served as a linguistic anchor that rooted the film, that the participants themselves described as atheistic, in a linguistic and theological landscape that they were able to engage with in meaningful ways. When asked if they thought their faith had an impact on their film watching, one participant remarked, "It's our perspective. It's our lens. It's our world view." However you want to put it. So yes, of course it affects everything I watch, see, read. For my participants, it was not only those instances of explicit theology that they were able to identify and engage with, but also the implicit faith connections. This was very interesting for me, as this may continue to open up the possibility for continued dialogue between faith and film. Now, this is nothing new in and of itself. People like Clive Marsh, Robert K. Johnson have been writing on this relationship for years. But it may be that we are able to engage in this conversation beyond the explicitly present faith narratives in film, and instead engage more intentionally with film narratives that contain implicit themes within the films themselves. Dr. Merrill Hale mentioned something akin to this on AST's podcast a few weeks ago, remarking that this is the direction that her and John Lydon are trying to move towards in the academic study of faith and film, from the explicit to the implicit. In this, it is interesting to see that at least for these two focus groups, Christians can't help but be Christian, even in the movie theater. We are anchored by our experiences, and sometimes we are even surprised ourselves to see where God shows up. My third theme tonight is divergent faith. I was extremely interested to hear one of my participants remark that divergents are analogous to people of faith. One of the major thematic components of many dystopian narratives is the movement from an idealistic or utopic image of society, generally presented at the beginning, towards a movement towards a dystopian reality. One of the most common ways this movement is accomplished is through the experiences of a single or a small group of characters that for one reason or another don't fit in the seemingly utopian society. Now, each narrative has its own version of this: Deckard in Blade Runner, Neo in The Matrix, or Katniss Everdeen in The Hunger Games. The true extent and depths of the human-made nightmare is revealed to the audience through the eyes of these characters. After the revelation is made, it also becomes their responsibility to evoke some kind of change to save humanity from itself. Emily Zemler points to this same movement when she writes, "In Divergent, the young heroine Beatrice becomes a vehicle for change by challenging the status quo." A number of my participants reported a similar feeling of divergence in their own faith lives. Some felt that this divergence put them at odds with society as a whole, even going so far as to feel like a life of faith was antithetical to the ways that the rest of the world operated. They felt that their Christian values put them at direct odds in the world, sometimes leaving them separated or disconnected. For some, it meant that they felt called to be Christian or to be spiritual, but not to belonging to the systems of physical or socio-political order. But while it was interesting, this aspect of this theme, it wasn't the only form of divergent faith that my participants recorded. Some also talked about feeling divergent within their own faith traditions. In these instances, participants reported feeling like they often had to pretend or portray the right kind of faith, or they had to maintain certain beliefs or traditions within their own faith communities. Through the course of the film, they were drawn to and felt connected to the film and its main character's need to hide in a system unwilling or unable to accommodate an inability to fit in. My participants used the film as a frame of reference to talk about divergence and how they feel like they don't fit in, and how that can be how we feel in our own faith. For some, this feeling of divergence was rooted in an eclectic denominational background. They had moved from one Christian denomination to another a few times over the course of their lives, until finally finding a home, yet always feeling like they didn't quite fit in because they weren't born into it. Yet always, for some, this sense of divergence came out of theological differences between previous experiences or congregations, again leading to a sense that they just don't quite fit in. You could tell that this topic had touched some of my participants in some deep and meaningful ways. And it was fascinating that through the struggles of the characters in this film, they were able to not only relate, but open up about their own stories and talk about it during the focus groups. I found each of these instances extremely interesting and important to consider on a number of levels. As the church and people of faith, we tend to be more accustomed to the idea of being divergent or set apart from society as a whole, wanting as a people of faith to operate differently, and readily picking up the countercultural torch as a hallmark of the life lived in true Christian fashion. And rightfully so. We strive for charity in a world that seeks the security of overabundance. We risk vulnerability in a world that upholds self-sufficiency. We see the world around us differently, and in ways that often puts us at odds with the status quo. But my participants pointed out that as people of faith, we are also able to become the status quo, all too easily defining the limits and confines of our own internal societies. As in dystopian films, it is the outside, the marginalized perspective, that can help cast a discerning and sometimes critical eye on society, whatever its form. But within both of these forms of divergent faith, what stands out is the ability for my audiences and participants, at least as represented by my focus groups, to converge and connect with these styles of narratives in critical and engaging ways. My focus groups were not simply passive consumers of the story, but instead used the story presented as a starting point to engage with their faith in meaningful ways. Perhaps there exists within the reels of dystopian films a useful storytelling tool for the church as a whole, to look with a critical eye on both our world and our church. The final theme that I would like to discuss with you this evening is one that I am calling Christian multiplicity. And this theme really developed out of a single question that I asked both of my focus groups. I was keenly interested to see how my participants saw their faith operating in their lives and how they might label these impacts, especially after just seeing a dystopian film. So I asked both groups, would you say that your faith is utopian or dystopian? Not an easy question by any means. But I was struck by how openly and honestly the question and the ensuing conversation was received. I was also struck by the answers of my participants, who responded with a refusal to answer. Straight up. And this wasn't an I don't know kind of refusal. This was a well thought out, I can't and I won't answer just one or the other. They said that they couldn't answer the question with an either or because their faith wasn't that cut and dry. That their faith, either in the world as a whole or their own experience of the world or even what they might imagine their world to be, couldn't and wouldn't be defined by such a binary either or kind of a question. One participant, after a lengthy exposition of the question, said that as a Calvinist Christian, I actually have to say both utopian and dystopian. And this was a sentiment that the rest of the group quickly picked up on and agreed with, saying that their faith wasn't either utopian or dystopian, but rather both. Always both. This refusal to adopt an either-or understanding of faith was present in the other focus group as well, in which participants talked about having a central understanding of their faith that was utopian, but that the broader picture or the experience of that faith lived out in the world was actually more dystopian. In this focus group, participants made comments like, it's both at the same time. It's the multiplicity that makes it what it is. That an important part of being and acting and living as a Christian was acknowledging and even embracing the multiplicity in that title. Another participant said that the telos of faith is utopian, but the experience of faith is dystopian. Faith doesn't negate suffering. Interesting link to the role and the presence of suffering in Christianity. The idea that while Christians see the positive in our vision and recognition of faith, of hope, of love, my participants were not willing to discount the negative or the challenging aspects of their Christian calling. They identified that while there are aspects of the Christian faith that can be defined as utopian at its center, there always remains a part of the experience of Christianity that is better understood as dystopian. I think it's an interesting theme to come out of my research because, again, it demonstrates the ability and the desire of audiences to make deeper connections with the movies that they are experiencing and their own faith journeys. These connections are more than just the overt, the explicit, or the easy connections. What I found with my participants was a desire to go beyond the heroine equals Jesus narrative and instead dig deeper and look to the narrative itself. As they did this, they not only uncovered some interesting connections, but were also able to see their own faith with something other than blind positivity or outright rejection. They were able to find their own way and meaning in the narrative of the film itself. Again, in a film that had been previously identified as atheistically barren of God's presence. Now, I'm sure that some of this can be explained by the questions that I was directly asking, and again, the participants that I had engaged. But this may actually be one of the wider implications of this study. Through this study, I have seen that people are able to watch and engage with dystopian narratives on a theological level, and have come out of the experience thinking not only about the film itself, but also about their faith. Popular, Hollywood-style, seemingly atheistic films helping to do the work of theology. There is a longing and connection with dystopian films today as a genre. Something in contemporary culture is happening. There's a sense of alienation or disconnectedness with many people that go to see these films. And I think it's important for us to reflect on how these narratives may resonate with our faith narratives. I think it's also true that dystopian films can function in our current culture as powerful prophetic voices. Visions of a future gone or led astray that on one hand can make us fearful of the future, but on the other can also present a sense of hope. Just as the apocalyptic writings can function in our scripture, a prophetic voice of warning on one hand, but also a deep sense that being different, that being set apart may be what culture needs from us. As Christians, we are a storytelling people. But it is how we seek meaning in these stories that truly define who we are in the world. Through this study, I have come to the conclusion that Christians are not purely concerned with escapism, distraction, or visual satiation when they go to the theater. We are not merely consumers of narrative, but rather people that actively seek meaning and connection between the narratives we experience and the faith that we profess. It may be that as Christians we are strangers in a strange land, but it also may be that what makes us strangers, what makes us divergent, may also make us relevant in an unknown future that is before the church. As Shailene Woodley, the star of Divergent, said in an interview about being divergent doesn't mean that you have to climb buildings or jump off trains, but you can find the courage to stand up for what you believe in and diverge from mediocrity. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Wow, so much in that. Fascinating, so many things.
Thank you. So in 3 of the presentations that we've heard from today, I've heard the term the outsider used, and those 3 have also talked about vulnerability. I think maybe specifically noting a lack of vulnerability as being sort of a characteristic of the strong, or of those who sometimes hold like the societal mean or a status quo. And I was wondering if from this perspective of dystopian film, if you could, in your research, if you could comment on why you think youth are being drawn to this narrative of the outsider through dystopian film, and what message that has for those who do hold the mean, both within the church and within society.
Yeah, great question, thank you. One of the things that I've found in sort of talking and doing work with youth is that through social media especially, and sort of modern culture, there's the impression that we have to be perfect all the time. Nothing goes up on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter without it being photoshopped or taken perfectly. There's lots of models that have come out against their own profiles saying, you know, this one perfect image took 1,000 takes to make. There's a refusal for vulnerability, right? We cannot be seen publicly as anything other than perfect. And perfect and perfection, while it's totally this social construct, doesn't exist, right? And yet, as the church, I think we need to do a better job of saying that we don't come to this thing we call faith, we don't come to this, even church, as perfectly veneered individuals. We come with all of our faults, with all of our inabilities and scars, and we are sort of vulnerable to one another. And in that vulnerability, we find community. But in dystopian films, there's this idea that not fitting in is somehow elevated and actually becomes salvific. That being different, somehow separated from that ideal of perfection, can actually be a benefit to something other than themselves, to the wider sort of society as a whole. And I think that's an opportunity that we have in the church to say, yes, and that's where we stand. That's what we sort of represent as people of faith, as that voice from the margins to the margins and always with the margins. That we sort of exist in that world. Does that answer the question? Brian?
I haven't seen the film,
No worries.
but I noticed the name Beatrice for the heroine.
Yep.
Beatrice of Dante, the etymological root, blessed. Could you comment on whether Beatrice is an accidental choice for a name, or there might be something deeper?
I'm not the author. I don't know how those character choices were made, but my participants did pick up on that and reflected on sort of there are other characters in the film that also have sort of biblical based names as well. So it wasn't lost on my participants by any means. I would think that it probably was intentional. I know the author does come from a faith background. But as far as whether those choices were made intentionally, I'm not too sure. But it did come up in one of my focus groups, So it was interesting to see, again, not only that my participants were sort of seeing the easy answers, but also wanting and willing to go deeper through those sort of more implicit themes that might be there. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much for a totally fascinating presentation. I have a couple of comments. First of all, I just very recently finished reading a book, which was also film. I haven't seen the film, called My Sister's Keeper. And it was dystopian in the sense of dysfunctional. I mean, it was just a painful family dynamic to get through the book. It was just like a morass. It was slogging. But it was beautiful. It was vulnerable. And there were so many dimensions. The father used to like to go up to the top of the fire station, sit on the roof and look at the stars. But he was more fascinated by the black holes, which have more energy. I couldn't help thinking that I was looking, all your slides are like black holes with colors around. And as if it's sort of like a dystopian focus which actually sort of highlights the colors and the light around. So I don't want you to. I think it would spoil it for you to explain the art of your slides, but the artistry is fascinating.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Anybody? Oh. Justin, I was struck, by the. Going back to the divergent, the sense of divergent, and our faith is. I'm coming to you. The faith is, we're divergent because we're people of faith. But do you think that there is a sense in which belonging to a church, or even being in ministry, there is that need to conform, that is in kind of inherent in the church, particularly those who are trying to go into ministry, the sense of needing to conform to be the church, but yet there's the paradox of, Jesus was countercultural and all of that. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I see where you're going, and I guess my first reaction is that our sort of role as clergy or upholders of sort of that tradition, as inheritors of that tradition, is an important one to recognize. But it only maintains as much control or limitations on our sort of ministry and work in the world as we let it. I think, today's society is moving towards a point at which the church no longer has the perceived authority that it used to. So we actually have a harder job, I think, before us to sort of understand and present ourselves as culturally relevant before we actually get to say what people should conform to or not. I think sort of the more meaningful way we engage in ministry today is to tell the narratives that we think honestly change lives. These stories are powerful stories that impact the way that we live, the way that we breathe, and the way that we interact not only with each other but with the world. And those stories themselves aren't dependent on the structures of the church. We can uphold some of the important aspects of those traditions, and we ought to, for sure. But the moment that they sort of hold us back from doing the mission and the ministry that we are called into, we need to look at those things. So they have as much power as we give them.
Justin, so earlier on in your presentation, you were talking about how the participants saw that God was not present in these films, that these films were coming from an atheistic standpoint, but they had difficulty viewing the films without bringing their Christian faith to it. I'm wondering whether it's beneficial to see the films from that atheistic standpoint. Is that possible if you are coming from a Christian standpoint?
I certainly think it's possible. There's nothing that sort of negates me from sort of separating my Christian faith and watching something that is, ethically or morally deplorable as purely entertainment. And there may be some value in that. I think just the prevalence of some of these dystopian films in society certainly attest that people don't need to have sort of a faith background to see these films or to sort of understand some of the thematic movements or even the cultural critiques that are in these films. So I think it's certainly possible. As people of faith, I mean, it's hard for me to answer that question as sort of a theology student, right? Because we've spent all this time sort of training our brains to see everything in the theology and in that sort of lens and worldview. So it's certainly possible for people in our congregations to set that aside, I think, for sure. But it was interesting to see that even though my participants said, "Oh no, I'm not going to worry about this," all of a sudden these themes of like faith, hope, and love were all there.
Yeah, I just wonder whether we miss something about the viewpoint of the film and maybe the viewpoint of some of these other dystopian films if we don't take seriously that they're coming from a standpoint that does not include God.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's definitely possible. And I can't speak for all of sort of dystopian film as a genre, but I know the author, like Veronica Roth, definitely comes at it from a faith perspective. As the series goes on, it gets a little bit, her theology gets a little bit confusing to track. But yeah, absolutely. And I think we run the risk as Christians of doing that anywhere, regardless of what we do, right? And we've seen that in sort of our colonial heritage as well. Well-meaning, sort of intentioned proselytization that has come on the backs of really sort of cultural ignorance. So we always sort of need to be able to keep that in the back of our mind. So I think it's really important to bring it up. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, I thought I saw your hand. Okay, sorry. Anybody else? I was just struck by, in these films, and a lot of these films, there is a strong female hero figure. The Star Wars, this latest Star Wars movie, and the sort of the message is, you've got this thing, you can do this on your own, and the strong female figure, and who's smarter than everybody else and figures everything out. But yet do you think there is a sense kind of that there is more to it than that there's more a sense of a theological, the faith, hope, and love piece that is behind that?
Behind the role of the women in the films?
For the women.
to be totally blunt, I mean, the role of women in the films as main characters is just catching up with the times. Like, it's about time. I mean, I hate to just say like it's 2015 and drop the mic, but like, so on a theological level, I don't know. I would sort of be reticent to sort of reading too strongly into that, and more just attesting to the fact that like it's about time that we sort of catch up.
Yeah,
to
I agree with you.
the ability for women to have predominant and heroine roles in our films.
I'd just like to make one comment on those female characters, because me and my girlfriends have been talking a lot about that. But one thing we've noticed is that in the case both with Divergent and with Rey, and also with Katniss Everdeen in the Hunger Games, Rey is the new heroine in the latest Star Wars film, there is a vulnerability to them as well. Like, they're not just these unstoppable heroes without showing sort of this softer side, which is interesting in terms of modeling female sort of hero.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely, great point. Yeah, but again, I think if those characters were to purely emulate masculine roles as females, we actually take away some of the power of those roles as well, to be feminine in and of themselves, as opposed to sort of masculine images projected onto women. So yeah, there is something important about maintaining a vulnerability. What I would like to see as well is a push back towards sort of masculine or male heroes imbuing that same vulnerability, which would be interesting to see how sort of Hollywood would react to that. I don't know.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Justin.